Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 425. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 425 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about this concept called smart spaces. Essentially, what we're focusing in on is how to use your building automation system, how to do some basic integrations to really increase occupant comfort, to increase tenant satisfaction. So the name of the game here is going to be, what can we do with what we have to increase the tenant experience without blowing our budget? As always, everything will be available at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/425. Once again, that is podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/425. And by the way, I'll mention this again. You'll be seeing an official launch video coming out about it, but we are releasing our owner operator course on Monday. It's going to be everything we've been being asked by owner operators to help them with, everything from operations, service, test and balance, commissioning, O&Ms, energy management. It's all going to be packed into an action-oriented online course that will be becoming available for purchase on Monday. I should tell you what date that is, right? Because if you're listening to this in the future, that's Monday, May 15th of 2023. All right, let's dive in. Let's have some fun. So we have been talking about smart for a while now, right? I've talked about a lot about integration. Those of you who don't know, I'm going to give you 15 seconds of why you should listen to me. I have done the use cases, the integration, and the design for some of the most complex buildings in the United States. I used to run a technical integration program at a large OEM where I was working on use cases for everything from lighting to nurse call to patient surveillance, everything, and building automation, lighting, access control, AV, all the regular stuff. So I've got a lot of experience bringing those things together. What I want to do for you today is give you a framework on how to index the use cases you need to make your building smart, how we can do it by a space-by-space concept, because that's really how I believe you should approach intelligent use case design, is by types of spaces, not typically systems. I start with the space and the user and the stakeholders, and we go from there. So I want to do that. Once we've indexed the systems and spaces, once we've figured out some basic use cases, I want to go into talking about how do we actually implement this? What can you do that's cheap or low cost that provides a disproportionate return on investment? Okay, so what is a smart space? Why do you hear about it all the time? And what does it mean? I mean, we've talked about digital twins. We talked about smart buildings. We've talked about middle layers, AI, all this stuff. Smart spaces is something that keeps coming back and back again. Essentially, the theory is that you have a space and you want to ensure that it works for the person who's utilizing it. The most common smart space that pretty much everyone is familiar with and has the expectation that it is smart is the smart conference room. So in the past, that simply meant having an AV panel that you could easily plug your laptop into, and it would show up on a screen on the wall. Nowadays, people are expecting much more. They're expecting integrated AV. They're expecting integrated shading and lighting. They're expecting integrated temperature control. They want this all tied into some form of scheduling system and maybe even some sort of pathfinding or wayfinding system as well. Whether that's through digital signage, whether that's through an integration to some form of map application. There's a variety of ways you can approach this. Now, if you heard all that and you're like, holy crap, this is totally overwhelming, don't worry. Let's start at a much simpler place, which is, what do you do today in your spaces? So that's a question for the audience. I want you to kind of pause here for 15 seconds or so. Think to yourself, while I'm talking, what use cases, what space types do we have? Are you even aware? If I said in K through 12, what space types do you have? We've got office space, right? You've got classroom space. You've got hallway space, bathroom space, gym space, locker space. Maybe you even have some specialty spaces, maybe for computer programming, maybe for a machining lab room. Maybe you have a greenhouse. Maybe you have fields and you have irrigation. So that would be considered an outdoor space. So all of these spaces serve different purposes, right? If you think about a classroom, what is the purpose? Is to support the learning environment, to support the process of learning. So everything that happens within that space should support it. Now, there's ancillary pieces that support that, right? You have safety and security. We all know what's going on right now in the culture. So I'm not even going to dive into that. But is a need for safety and security. You have the ability to teach. So there's a need for AV. There's also things like acoustics. Can the people in the back of the room hear you? There's things like temperature control and fresh air. Is the space optimized to reduce CO2, to keep people awake? Does the lighting dynamically change? These are all things that can be done in a simple classroom space. So I've named 7 different use cases right there in this smart space. So the first thing you want to do is we want to list out our smart spaces. So those of you who are driving and listening to this, don't do what I'm about to say, pull over, but pull out a pen and a piece of paper if you're a facility manager, or maybe you are a contractor who supports facilities, and write down the types of spaces for that facility. You know, if you're listening to this after the fact, pause the video. If you're listening to this live, definitely come back to this exercise. But I want you to sit down. I want you to take K through 12, healthcare, higher ed, institutional, government, corporate business, whatever you support, and write down the space types. There's usually about a dozen, maybe a little less. Now that you've got the space types written down, now we're going to move on to use cases. I don't want you to overthink this. People hear use cases and they feel very overwhelmed. They envision this UML diagram with technology systems tied together. If they're a technologist, if they're a business person, they picture process maps and different business processes that come together to produce a use case. And if you're in accounting, you just picture dollars. But it doesn't have to be that complex. For use cases, I just want you to think of, what would you use the space for? If we know we're using the space for learning in the classroom example, what needs to support that? We need AV, we need temperature, we need CO2 control, right? We need safety, we need lighting. These are all use cases that you can create. For example, in the morning, you may want to have warm lighting. You're like, warm lighting? Why? Doesn't that calm people down? Yes. You're going to have kids who are maybe hopped up on sugar, ramped up. You want to calm them down in the morning so that they pay attention to classes. And then towards the afternoon, after they have that, wonderful school lunch of pizza and chicken fingers or whatever, you want to go and ramp them up. You want to give them energy. So you shift the lighting to cool lighting. Warm lighting tends to depress, and I don't mean depress like, oh, I'm sad. I mean, just like calm down people. And then cool lighting tends to go and warm up people. So it gets them energized. So you're saying, all right, we can control the lighting based on the time of day. Additionally, can look at CO2. That's a very simple thing to control in a space with a $200 sensor, and it has a disproportionate impact in what I like to call long-term use spaces. So a classroom would be a long-term use space, a bunch of students stuck in there, may have inadequate ventilation. You want to go and address that. All right, so we've built out these use cases. We've built out a list of maybe 2 to 3 use cases. Now we want to try to identify the value of this use case. What does it mean if students are more attentive during class? What does it mean if they're more controlled during class? That means, maybe less fights, less conflict, less distractions. If they're more attentive, that means more engagement, higher grades, better student state test scores, etc. I hope you're paying attention to this from both a facilities as well as a contractor perspective, because this is the language you need to utilize when you go to sell these use cases to higher ups who maybe just aren't really that savvy with facilities. Maybe you're selling it to a superintendent, etc. So once you've got these outcomes aligned with the use cases for the space, now comes the fun part. We got to index our technology. We have to understand, what do we have in our technology set that we can utilize right now? What do we have that maybe takes some integration? And what would we need to add? So right off the bat, you look up, you see lights. Okay, we've got lights. You look on the wall, there's a thermostat. Okay, we've got temperature sensing and some form of temperature control. Speaking of which, I'm going to turn on my new split system here and make it a little cooler in this room. So you've got that. All right, you've got temperature control. You've got lighting. Maybe you've got access control, keeping the doors locked, etc. Maybe you've got AV. You've got a smart whiteboard. Maybe you've got speakers in the back of the room to project the teacher's voice forward. Who knows? But you've indexed your technology. That is called your as-is technology, or your as-is architecture, if you want to be technical. Once you have your as-is architecture, as-is technology, you need to determine where you're going. Well, if our use case is to change the lights based on time of day, there's a couple ways we could do that, right? We could get multicolored light bulbs that are both warm as well as cool. So warm is, 2,700 Kelvin, and cool is 5,000 Kelvin, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you've got multi-use light bulbs with maybe a slider. And you go and you have someone manually change the light warmth based on time of day. Not very efficient, probably not the best use case, probably is going to fall apart. So maybe we need to go a step further. Maybe our light control could be controlled by a potentiometer. Maybe we have a 0 to 10 volt signal that goes to a potentiometer that from our BAS that enables us to change the resistance, which is usually how these light switches work. They're resistance based sometimes. And we're able to go and change the resistance and thus change the light temperature. Now, maybe we actually have a lighting system. Maybe we have a Lutron or whoever lighting system, and they have a backnet integration. Now we can actually integrate with those points, and dynamically based on time of day and real-time occupancy, we can change the warmth of the lights. So that is how you take your as-is architecture, your use case, and your identified technologies. And now you go and you say, all right, I've identified these technologies. This is where we need to get. And you start to implement a plan. And your goal here is to prioritize your top use cases by ROI. And ROI does not necessarily have to be financial. It could be the lighting is horrible. You've got like T8 ballasts and they flicker and everyone feels like they're in a 1970s horror movie. And you're like, man, if we just change out these ballasts, we're going to get a much better. Like, have you ever went in a room and it had really bad lighting and you went into it after a lighting retrofit and it had really nice lighting and you're like, oh my gosh, it feels totally different in this space? It can have a dramatic effect. And so the ROI may not be financial, but it may be student engagement, higher test scores, etc. All right. So I'm going to pause for a second because I've talked for 15 minutes now about this concept. And before we go further, I want to kind of just let people ask whatever questions they've got, give you a chance to kind of just digest what is going on. And then we'll dive into a little bit more, like some tips around how to go and assess this, how to actually deploy it, how to prioritize it. And then we'll wrap up with some questions. So let me check the usual suspects here, see kind of if we have anyone. And by the way, all you got to do is you just got to type in chat and I'll see it pop up. And I'd love to answer your questions. I'm one of those people who like feeds off of audience engagement. The more audience engagement there is, the more energetic I'm able to be, the more I love answering questions. And so I welcome those. All right, not seeing any though. Let's talk about use cases and prioritization. So you've listed out the use cases, you've listed out the technologies, you've defined which use cases should be prioritized. What's next? Now you have to actually come up with a plan to implement whatever strategies. And this can be done in-house or it could be done potentially with a contractor. It just depends. I tend to find like higher ed usually will execute a lot of integrations in-house. Like K through 12 market will tend to outsource it. It just depends. And I've seen some very sophisticated K through 12. I've seen some very unsophisticated healthcare organizations. It's all over the place as far as skill set level. So you have to have an honest evaluation of your skill set. And then you have to look at what is the impact of this use case that you're going to implement, the smart space that you're going to implement. Maybe it is an operating room that you're making smart. And for every hour that's down, it's several $1,000s of revenue that the hospital's not generating. So you need to be very strategic about prioritization. Or maybe it's a school and you have the entire summer to come in and do a retrofit. So first things first, we have to figure out, once we have a prioritized list, what is our schedule? So that's number one, schedule. How long is it going to take? When does it need to start? And when do I need to do it? Because working at a hospital, maybe I have to do stuff at night. But maybe I also have sound restrictions because I'm working on a patient floor at night. So that makes me have to do things much slower. Maybe I'm able to only make cuts into drywall or whatever on the weekends, but I can do other work during the week. And so I've got interdependencies. Once you've got that figured out, you've got your schedule, then you have to figure out your contingency. So contingency is, what if this all falls apart? All right. It's different than dependency. So contingency is like a backup plan. This is my contingency plan. So if I go and I change out the lights and all of a sudden I cut into the ceiling and I realize like, oh my gosh, this is a rat's nest of wire. This is like not according to code. I'm going to have to redo wiring. That now extended me by 2 weeks. What do I do? So I have contingencies for common failures. Dependencies are another thing you need to think about when you're implementing these smart spaces. You have to think about, what does this depend on? Who does this depend on? Let's talk about that smart conference room idea again. So Billy Bob is going to the office. He's finally going back after 3 years, and the office has this new system because they want to make it really cool for him so that he has a great experience. And he's supposed to go on to his email and to his calendar and then book a room. And when that room is booked, he then is going to go and take that room, or rather the system's going to take that room and take that email booking, and it's going to automatically schedule that space. And maybe it's going to say, oh, that space needs to be cooled before Billy Bob gets in there because he's like Phil Zito. He likes it 68 degrees in the space. So it has to turn the space on maybe 30 minutes before to get it pre-cooled. So you're starting to see these dependencies, right? There's a dependency on the IT staff and the ability to go and integrate with Outlook or whatever calendar system. That has to happen. There is a dependency with the BAS being able to even take a email integration. So you start to see these dependencies that you have in place, and you need to start listing those out. I know for those of you who run facilities, this feels like crazy overwhelming and very scary. I'll tell you, if you just simply get your spaces list out and your use cases listed out, you will find yourself to be in a much better place than you are. 1 second, sorry. I'm going to put, my wife is out of town because her mom is getting open heart surgery, or had open heart surgery. And I noticed she called me a couple times and I was like, is there an issue with the kids? Because sometimes the school calls prior to calling me. And I was like, oh, great. This is Comedy of Errors week. I'm like, the dog barking on Wednesday. And now is there going to be potentially something going on? But it looks like nothing urgent. All right. Like I said, so you have contingencies, you have dependencies, you have schedule. Now you need to move into execution. And execution can be done one of two ways. There is the pilot or mock-up scenario. I recommend that for mid to high complexity use cases, and I'll define what a low to mid to high complexity use case is in just a second. Or there's the just like do it. Just do it. So a low complexity would be something that can be done with relatively low skill level, utilizing existing systems and existing protocols. This would be like mapping in your lighting system into your building automation system. Assuming it's a backnet lighting system, it's on the same subnet as the BAS, and it's got the points that you need available. It should be as simple as a device discovery, so who is IAM, and then a property / object discovery, so who has I have. You run that, you add the lighting supervisory device to your tree, you add the points to your tree, you add them to graphics or do whatever you need to do. Pretty low level integration. A mid-level integration is one that utilizes the existing systems, but requires some form of intermediary. This may be like a protocol gateway. This may be something like grabbing a driver for a system. This may be adding physical devices, but you have to do some form of changes. It requires an understanding of protocols, of building automation systems, devices, etc. High complexity is the complex stuff, things where you have to write computer programming scripts and services. I'm reminded of one integration I did where the camera would sense occupancy. And based on the sensed occupancy, it would turn on the lights, it would send a notification, and it would pop up in an iframe the feed from the video in the building automation graphics. So that required some scripting, that required some services that had to run in the background. It required, I think I did it in .NET. So it required obviously programming, C# programming to be specific. So that's a high complexity integration / use case. So you got to rank that out and you've got to account for that, because that brings us to our next thing. These smart buildings are really cool and they do a lot of really cool stuff. And I enjoyed doing them. That was one of my happiest things to do. Happiest things. I don't even know if that's proper English. One of the things I really liked to do at my previous employer before I founded Smart Buildings Academy was to build out use cases. I liked building out use cases. I liked mocking them up. I liked just deep diving over the weekend, trying to make protocols work. But what I would notice once you got this all built and deployed, it was literally one patch away from failing. So I'm reminded of a Canadian airport, really major Canadian airport, that had an integration between the flight management system, the lighting, the HVAC, and I think the flight information system got patched. The API got updated, or deprecated is what they technically call it. It's where old functionality is deleted and or new functionality is added. Deprecation is taking the functionality away. So what happened is that API change broke things. The lights no longer automatically turned on. The HVAC no longer automatically turned on when the plane was at or not at the gate. And so now lighting and HVAC basically run on a dumb schedule, and they've lost all the energy efficiency of only having those variables turned on when something's at the gate. But at the end of the day, if you have a plan, it's not too terribly difficult to maintain integrations and use cases for smart spaces. And I just gave you another example of a smart space, right? In an airport, you have the terminals, you have security, you have baggage, you have parking, Yes, parking. How many parking garages have you went into that the ventilation system isn't working and you feel like you're going to die from CO poisoning? I mean, it's crazy. So there are plenty of use cases, plenty of space types, and plenty of outcomes that you can achieve by integrating existing technology. So there you have it, folks. That is smart spaces in a nutshell. I hope that you now have a framework to identify your spaces, step one, identify your use cases, step two, and identify your return on investment or outcome, step three, so you can sell it. Then once you've sold it, you understand that you have to, and also you have to identify your technology, step four. But then once you've sold it, you have to figure out your schedule, your dependencies, all of the different aspects that you need in order to effectively execute that use case. Let's dive in. I'd love to answer any questions you have about smart spaces, about use cases. Let me see what's going on. View this as free consulting. So, yeah. Let's take a look and see what we see in the question world. Let me see what's going on here. All right. Okie looks like, did the internet die on me? No, it didn't die on me. All right, we got one thing. So Andrew asks, do you have a sense that with high energy costs, people are beginning to accept less comfort to gain savings? So that is an interesting question, Andrew. And it's one I've wrestled with myself personally. I have my brand new split unit and I like to keep it really cold in this room. So I live in Arizona. Electrical costs aren't necessarily cheap. I mean, it's cheaper than California, but still a little expensive where I live. How do I determine what is my productivity worth? Now, take that same thought process and picture a commercial office space. These businesses have substantial amounts of employees that maybe don't want to go in the office, don't need to go in the office. And if you're telling them now that the office needs to be kept at 76 degrees or 78 degrees because of sustainability, how is that going to work? I sure as heck ain't going into that office. Nope. Not going to. I would be miserable. I hate heat. It would just be terrible. So you have to ask yourself, like, what is the facility? And this goes back to what I covered early in the podcast. What is the space? Who are the stakeholders? What is the outcome? And what's the ROI? So if you're a hospital and your main focus is producing the optimal healing environment, you're not going to go and change the OR's temperature because of some energy costs or sustainability mandates, because someone will die. They will get a staph infection or something if you have too much humidity or the temperature's wrong. It may interrupt with, if you don't keep the body cold enough, someone will die. Additionally, you got classrooms. Yeah, K through 12. Kids are kids, so you got a little more control there. But you move to higher ed, and you've got a bunch of parents who are donors to a university getting calls from their kids because their dorm room is kept at 80 degrees. And they'd be miserable, and they're going to complain. So my thought are, it depends. Sure, are there, like New York City with their local law and their energy mandates and penalties? Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if people leave the city, if people like turn those commercial assets into mixed use residential or something. Because if you're a business, are you going to accept $1 million fine and have your people be miserable? Especially when talent is one of the most competitive advantages an organization can have right now. These are all things that are wrestling. And I will say, and Todd mentions this as well. In my experience, I've seen resets being used a lot more for efficiency. There are things you can do. There's load based control, which means like if a space is empty, there's no need to be conditioning it at the same level as a space that's not empty. So occupancy load based controls. Additionally, recommissioning existing buildings. We've all seen 2x4s, holes inside of buildings, 2x4s and dampers, etc. So going and being aware of common system inefficiencies and failures is key to you being able to go and just trim some off the top without even really going to have to make a huge difference or a huge change in tenant comfort. Great questions, Andrew. Great comment, Todd. I appreciate both of you. Thanks so much. Let's see if anyone else has anything they'd like to add. All right. Man, I am hungry. My stomach is like going, feed me, Seymour. All right. Well, that being said, I do have to pick up the kids today and do a couple things. So the podcast will be uploaded probably in the next 6 hours at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com /3. No, oh my gosh, 3. What podcast are we on now? 425. And Andrew says, thanks, my best to Rachel. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Her mom is doing great, moving around. Everything's good. She should be back next Thursday. I'm excited. But then I got to go to New York the very next week. So it's going to be crazy. All right, everybody. I hope you all have an awesome rest of your week. Have a great weekend. Look forward to that announcement coming on Monday. This owner course is gonna be amazing. And since it's going to be an early access course, like all of our courses, you'll actually be able to help us create it from scratch by giving us feedback as we create the lessons. Thanks so much, everybody. And I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day. Take care.